Okay, let's jump straight into this explainer with a really powerful quote from 1945. Ain't no foreign country in the world foreign as Alabama to a New Yorker. Honestly, this perfectly captures the whole stranger in a strange land dynamic of the incredibly unique historical movement we're going to explore today.
So, welcome to today's explainer. We're going to be digging into Robin D.G. Kelley's book, Hammer and Hoe. It's this fascinating historical deep dive into how a radical grassroots movement was built completely from scratch by marginalized people in the 1930s Deep South. And with some added context from historian Howard Zinn, we're going to look at how a highly unlikely alliance took shape, defying just unimaginable odds to challenge the status quo of the time. Just to give us a quick roadmap for this explainer, we're going to cover the Alabama exception, organizing the unemployed, the sharecroppers union, culture and resistance, and finally, the movement's legacy.
Let's start with part one, the Alabama exception. Take a look at this illustration from the book's cover. It really visually grounds us in the unlikely coalition at the absolute heart of this story, the industrial worker, the sharecropper, and the Black community. You see, this movement wasn't imported by traditional Euro-American left-wing intellectuals. Not at all. It was built entirely from the ground up by local working people who were facing extreme daily systemic oppression in an era when just surviving was a struggle.
Now, picture this. Northern organizers travel down south, right? And they've got this strict set of expectations. They were looking to organize a secular, white, industrial workforce, basically the orthodox demographic for labor movements back then. But the reality they actually found in Alabama? Completely different. They found a population that was deeply religious, predominantly Black, agrarian, and largely unskilled. This massive cultural mismatch forced a total reimagining of how to organize. Because, let's be real, the strategies that worked in a New York factory simply were not going to fly in a southern cotton field. So, how did this all kick off? Well, the onset of the Great Depression in 1929 basically created a powder keg. By 1931, you have the Scottsboro Boys case, which involved false, highly publicized accusations against 9 Black teenagers, and that really ignited local outrage and political awakening. That exact same year, the Camp Hill shootout erupts. That was a violent clash between landlords and tenant farmers who were just trying to unionize. And the source points out that these weren't isolated incidents. They were intense catalysts that rapidly accelerated these mass campaigns, leading straight into the massive cotton pickers strike in 1935. Moving right along to Section 2, Organizing the Unemployed. When you look at devastated urban centers like Birmingham, you've got to realize these organizers weren't pushing abstract theoretical politics. They were fighting for immediate life-or-death survival. They demanded adequate relief, a halt to the relentless evictions that were just throwing jobless workers right onto the streets, and actual cash instead of meager, degrading food rations. And fundamentally, they demanded equal treatment for Black workers, who were routinely the very last to be hired and the absolute first to be fired when the economy tanked. According to Howard Zinn's text, local figures like Hosea Hudson really put a human face on these staggering numbers. Hudson actually helped organize a mass meeting in the dead of winter in 1932, bringing over 7,000 people to the courthouse steps. Think about that for a second. In the violently segregated South of the 1930s, seeing thousands of Black and white workers standing together in public to demand relief, that was a massive, dangerous, and almost unthinkable historical anomaly. All right, part 3, the Sharecroppers Union. Here, we're moving out of the city and into the rural Black Belt, a region named for its rich, dark soil and its long history of plantation agriculture. So that massive 1935 strike in Lee and Tallapoosa counties, it was sparked by one incredibly modest demand, just $1 per 100 pounds of picked cotton. I mean, it seems like absolutely nothing to us today, but in the sharecropping system, which was essentially designed to keep laborers in a state of perpetual debt, asking for a standardized living wage was treated by the landowning class as an act of open, literal rebellion. And because it was viewed as rebellion, attempting to unionize brought swift and brutal vigilante repression from landlords and the local police. The text notes that organizers like Ralph Gray, who was a local Black tenant farmer and union leader, faced intense and sometimes fatal violence simply for demanding fair pay. Open organizing wasn't just technically illegal, it meant risking your life and the lives of your family, basically inviting violent retaliation straight to your front door. Which brings us to Section 4, Culture and Resistance. Because carrying traditional political literature around was super dangerous and could easily get you arrested or worse, organizers had to get creative. They repurposed deeply rooted cultural traditions. They took traditional spirituals, like Go Down Moses, Way Down in Egypt Land, and adapted them into these powerful labor songs. They literally sang their struggle, using the familiar music of their communities as a direct tool for resistance, solidarity, and even coded communication right under the noses of the authorities.
Now, you might be wondering how radical politics meshed with religion. Well, the author points out that for the local rank and file, there was absolutely no contradiction between their deep religious faith and their militant labor rights. They drew immense strength from the prophetic tradition of Christianity. They saw their own fight against wealthy landlords mirrored perfectly in biblical stories of the Israelites' liberation from Egypt. So their faith didn't make them passive. It actually fueled their righteous demand for justice right here on earth.
And because open confrontation often meant literal death, this invisible army used incredibly clever underground tactics. They survived by wearing a mask of deception, basically acting docile, subservient, and compliant in front of the landlords during the day. But by night, they were secretly organizing in the shadows. They passed unsigned petitions and distributed handbills through these highly coordinated invisible networks that kept the whole movement alive despite the terror.
Let's head into our final section, the movement's legacy. When you step back and look at the whole historical trajectory of the region, this fascinating evolution emerges. The 1930s labor battles relied really heavily on the underground organizing and evasive resistance of groups like the Sharecroppers Union. But jump forward 30 years, and that exact same region becomes the epicenter for the open mass protest and voter registration drives led by groups like SNCC during the Civil Rights era.
And there's actually a literal human bridge between these two generations of activists. The texture's this amazing anecdote. In 1965, prominent civil rights leader Stokely Carmichael travels to Lowndes County, Alabama to organize. And he doesn't find a politically naive or blank slate, right? He encounters older, armed, and deeply resilient farmers who distinctly remember the labor struggles of 30 years prior. They hadn't forgotten a thing. And they passed their tactical knowledge, their skepticism, and their courage straight down to the youth of the 60s.
So, to wrap up our explainer, I want to leave you with this final, really provocative question from the text that kind of reshapes how we view American history. Did the forgotten underground tactics of 1930s Alabama quietly lay the crucial groundwork for the massive civil rights battles that erupted 3 decades later? It's just a fascinating reminder of how hidden, marginalized history often shapes the massive social movements of our modern world. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.